Hello, friends, and welcome to this special edition of Sonderverse Community, and it's going to be really great. I'm your OddRev, Will Nicholas, and look, we'll be back again also tomorrow night. So if you're thinking why you're here on Sunday instead of Monday for Odd Sonder will be on tomorrow evening, and it will be a great opportunity to regroup after the holidays. But we're here tonight for something particularly special, and I've got some amazing guests with us this evening. Just sit back and relax, enjoy the opportunity to be able to explore. But as always, make sure that you're got your chat fingers ready too. So we would love to hear your comments or questions along the way. I'm going to begin by introducing our guests this evening. And first off, actually, I might let our guests introduce themselves because they'll do a much better job at it than I will. I'll begin by introducing Professor James F. McGrath, who is visiting us all the way from the United States, and is the writer of several awesome science fiction books, which he's actually gifted me with one today. Time and I've got to go that way. Time and Relative Dimensions in Space, in Faith, sorry, which is all about religion and Doctor Who, and then theology and science fiction as well. I keep getting my left and right mixed up here. But many other books. And this morning we had the privilege of having James speak to us at St. David's, particularly about some of his work on John the Baptist and the Temple period. But James, what would you say about yourself in a couple of sentences for our viewers tonight?
Yeah, I think you covered most of it. So I'm someone who started out as a New Testament scholar and continue to teach and research in that area, but have also been described, at least in Australia, as a sci-fi theologian, and so do that sort of thing as well.
Yep. Good, and we'll hear much more about that in a moment. But going across from what is it, right to left, next box I've got down below me here is John Flett. John, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be on a panel such as this in relation to science fiction and theology?
I'm probably not sure, but I do a ton of gaming. And we end up having a lot of theological conversations while gaming.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's probably it.
There's a lot of science fiction in gaming as well, isn't there? I mean, as well as the fantasy genre, a lot of the games do transport us to other worlds and other places.
Well, I mean, if that's a question, I'd like to me, there are just those, like when I teach, there's just a ton of stuff that I use. Like, for example, the book of Canticle for Leibowitz.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So in the part of the Canticle for Leibowitz, there's a line that says that at the end of the day, we'll find that the devil was the most sincere person.
Yep. Yeah.
In other words, the devil believed in what he said more than anyone else.
Yeah. Yep.
Right.
No, that's cool.
So other people have doubts and all the rest of it. The devil never did. So, you bring in little things like that in theological discourse. It sort of transitions the type of discourse you're having.
And also we've got probably one of the biggest names in science fiction and theology in Victoria, Tasmania, Reverend Dr. Geek. Avril, thanks for joining us this evening. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and in particular some of the stuff you've done with science fiction and theology in your work?
Yeah, so I fell in love with primarily fantasy when I was 8 years old, and a teacher gave me a copy of The Hobbit, and that was it. That was me from the rest of my life. And years ago, an Australian comedian, Adam Hills, made fun of me, and that led to the Church of Latter-day Geeks, which were services in which cosplay church services that went on for a few years and were fabulous. So that's when I turned into Rev.Geek. In real life, I'm Uniting Church Minister at North Baldwin. But...
Fantastic. We all kind of have these superhero kind of aliases. I've noticed, John, you're Verg, and James, you're known online as Religious Prof. Is that right?
Religion prof.
Yep, Religion Prof. Yep. So we kind of these online handles, they become part of our identity as well, which is really exciting. We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. So some of the people who don't join us regularly might not know that, but one of the things we do with the Sonderverse community when we begin is we acknowledge the country from which we're broadcasting, and so I want to acknowledge this evening, that I'm broadcasting from Wathaurong country, and I pay my respects to those who have told stories and lived and worked and narrated in this space since time beyond our dreaming. And I'll invite you, if you're watching online this evening, to put into the chat where you might be receiving this broadcast from. James, obviously you're down the hall from me, so you're also broadcasting from Wathaurong country. But John and Avril, do you want to share with us where you're broadcasting from?
Yeah, I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri of the Kulin Nations.
I too am on the lands of the Wurundjeri of the Kulin Nations.
Look, storytelling, dreaming, imagining, very much a part of First Nations identity, and no stranger to many of the concepts. In fact, often I find that second peoples find that there is a stronger divergence between what we might call reality and what we might call fantasy, and it seems to matter a lot more to us and get in the way of us actually being able to make best use of our stories. I thought what we might do tonight, and to let things unfold, is have a bit of a play, a bit of game fun with it. And so I've got a list of proverbs, or two lists of proverbs. One list of proverbs that definitely come from the Bible, or our sacred text, and the other, which comes from science fiction, our other sacred text. And so I'm going to, at various times during the evening, just drop one of those in, and we can actually make a clear, decisive statement about whether we believe that comes from the Bible or from science fiction. So how does that sound if we give that a go?
Okay. Now, are you going to throw us curveballs by like reading it from the Message or something like that?
They're gonna come from all over the place. Yes. Yep.
Okay. Well, that's good. That would be a little bit harder.
It could go horribly wrong if, it turns out we don't actually know the Bible.
That's correct. Or if we actually don't know science fiction. So, let's give that a go. Okay. So the first one I've got is let's see. I'll go easy to begin with. I'll go very easy to begin with. How about the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few? Is that science fiction or biblical proverb?
It's sci-fi for sure, my friend.
Well, you want to tell us a bit more, John?
No.
The words of Spock.
Mm-hmm.
Vulcan wisdom.
Absolutely. So when we're going to take this kind of idea that there are these proverbs in science fiction that might be as meaningful or guiding or thought-provoking as we might find in our biblical texts, where might we go with that? James, did you want to kick us off with some thoughts around that?
Well, maybe the place to start is that I'm pretty sure I saw like a Wrath of Khan, tragic ending Christmas ornament, and somebody had captioned it that remembering as we celebrate this time of year the sacrifice that one man made on behalf of the many, or something like that, couching it in what sounds like religious language. And I think that making the comparisons can help us to think about things like the fact that we might encounter sooner or later other living entities, right, that are sentient, and we should expect them to have wisdom, tradition of their own. The wisdom tradition in the Bible is all about observing what anyone can observe, right? Even somebody who's from Egypt or from Mesopotamia who doesn't have Israelite texts or presuppositions can look at the world and draw conclusions. And so that's what makes the wisdom tradition in the Bible so rich to compare with the things we find in other terrestrial cultures, but also among the Vulcans or whoever else. So I think that was a good one to start off with.
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I always thought that was highly colonialist.
Yep. Yeah, go ahead. Go on. Say some more about that.
So, I mean, you get famous stories through history of where basically one person was sent off to go die so that other people might live, but it wasn't necessarily of their own choice or their own volition. And we do that quite a bit. So there's an easy way to turn that into a religious sort of thematic, but it's an easy statement, and it's
Yep.
an easy statement to apply to other people or to apply what other people have done, and sort of come up with this sort of Martha narrative that a lot of feminist theologians have sort of spoken against. The book, I forget the second one, but it's about the sparrow.
Mary Doria Russell, The Sparrow and Children of God.
So I think it might have been in the second one, but it was when the one of the main characters. It's an excellent series. Go and read it. But it's about this church that goes into the world, goes into the first ones to be able to go into the universe, and then there's this really horrible rape scene where one person sort of goes into a human doesn't realize what the sort of rituals are of the place, and they go in there and they're raped continually as a sort of consort. But the same sort of theme about there's an individual that's sacrificing for the sake of everyone, but it looks a lot like rape. So it's an interesting. Well, I mean, like one of the things about sci-fi is I find it really ambiguous.
Mm-hmm.
That we can sort of, there's always dual inferences that can be purchased from any one of these sort of singular statements, which of course is also very biblical.
And I imagine, you could say the same thing about scriptural texts, couldn't you? I mean, that there's a sense in which often, people will actually appropriate them to be able to get the thing that they want to have happen. Have you got any thoughts about that, Avril?
Two thoughts. One was the Ursula Le Guin short story, and I cannot remember it, but The People Who Walk Away about
yeah.
Yep, thank you. The idea of a perfect society that is based on the ill treatment of one individual and the need to walk away from that. And the other is the bit of me that studied human rights law really struggles with the needs of the many must outweigh the needs of the few, because sometimes that few, even though their needs are different from that of the majority, need to be protected and looked after. So I think possibly the theologian in me is, yes, the needs of the many, but the bit of me that did law is going, no, the minority must also be protected.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I mean, one of the things that's fascinating about this particular quote that does come from Star Trek: The Wrath of Khan is that it's poignantly displayed in the sacrifice of Spock at the end of that movie, and then completely contradicted by the next movie when the entire crew actually sacrifices itself in order to go back for the one. And so there's this really interesting dialogue within itself that's actually saying, well, on this particular day it's this way, but on this particular day it's the opposite way. And I think that's a fascinating thing to keep in mind when we're thinking about texts that actually provide us with meaning.
Yeah,
The one sheep.
Yeah, well, yeah, good connection to make there. I was just going to say that the Proverbs are very much contextual wisdom. You can find proverbs side by side in the book of Proverbs in the Bible that are saying the exact opposite of one another, right? Do not answer a fool according to his folly. Here's why. Answer a fool according to his folly. Here's why. It's a common and troubling way of interpreting, for instance, the Proverbs 31 woman, and taking it as here's what you must do, rather than here's what someone did, and I'm putting this inside her birthday card kind of thing to thank you for all of this. And so Spock finding saying I value my life less than that of the others. We shouldn't view that as really a contradiction to a group of friends saying we want to rescue him if we can, and to legislating, as Avril pointed out so importantly, that a society that always just lets the majority get its way in ways that harm others is far from an ideal model for a society. And so turned it from proverb of personal morality into law, it would be something that goes from being inspirational to arguably immoral.
I can see you nodding there, Avril. You got something you want to throw in on top of that?
No, I was just thinking that one of the difficulties we so often have is we turn religion into law, and it doesn't really work that way.
Yep, and the Proverbs, it's really fascinating that any proverb or these kind of statements that are sort of, as John, you said, quite open-ended, and they're designed for us to be able to engage with and to play with and to explore, not to actually receive as an absolute that says, okay, this is the way that things must be done. Oh, I think you might be muted, John.
Yeah. Well, one of the questions I have is about toxic masculinity through those types of movies. So they're great movies. I love them. But, to what extent you'll get a ton of feminist theology that talks about the whole Martin narrative, which is a personal morality decision. It's not a law, but it's actually the goal to look for.
Yep. So
in other words, it's really positive if you feel that you should die on behalf of someone else. And it becomes the sort of way in which, according to feminist writers, it becomes a male vision of actually what the good is. So the good is that you die, and that you die with some sort of meaning to your death, right? It's the glorious warrior. I'm going out, they're attacking me. I'm going to fall on my sword and I'm going to save everyone. So, yes, it's just another perhaps theological perspective.
So I might cross the Proverbs further down the list, off the list that also comes from Star Trek, which is "Today is a good day to die," which obviously comes from the Klingons. That culture really values what they might call a good death, so that certainly fits along that vein of what we might consider to be toxic masculinity, although the female Klingons are just as happy to seek a good death as well. So
to what extent is that a male writing for female characters in the 60s?
Quite possibly, or even more recently. Yeah, go on, Avril.
There's a series that Marion Zimmer Bradley wrote, the Darkover series, Space Telepathy, and it makes the comparison between childbirth and being a warrior really explicit. Like in either you're facing death for the sake of a greater good, and because they're a telepathic race, people of any gender can actually experience that. And I've always liked that explicit comparison of the risk of childbirth with the great big masculine, let us fight with swords to save our people.
Did you know, you may not know, but if women during the Nazi period had, I think it was over 6 children, they got a special medal from Hitler because they were doing their job for the meat grinder.
Yes, but in the same way, we would say that fighting for the Nazi regime bad, fighting against the Nazi regime good.
Also bad.
Well, I don't know. I tend to lean towards Bonhoeffer. Sometimes there is a time to assassinate Hitler.
Yeah. So let's not talk about the assassination of Trump then.
Obviously, the Democrats do not believe he's Hitler, because if they did, they would not be praying for his, safety and recovery. Anyway, move on.
Well, perhaps another proverb would be good to move us along. How about as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another?
I'm going to go Bible.
It's Bible, although it's a familiar one where there's also some debate about the translation.
Is that Ecclesiastes rather than Proverbs?
No, it's a proverb 6:6. So yeah, so I mean, it's amazing how there are these kind of statements that actually need to be open to interpretation, translation, discussion in both of these kinds of texts, which is something to reflect on.
As an academic, I always believed that one.
So say a bit more about the sharpening of people against people. What does that mean to you?
Oh, to me, that's always like an academic, like if you're trying to bring forward. So to me, it's a statement about the truth. So in other words, if you're going to say something and you need to argue it cogently, and someone comes up and says, no, you're missing out all these voices, or your argument's flawed in such a way, I end up learning. So I never had a problem with that, though I do know a lot of people also find that perhaps part of toxic masculinity. But I always found like sitting with people in discussion.
Yep.
Minority voices, female voices, indigenous voices. You actually end up learning a ton, and hopefully yourself becoming better through those sort of discourses.
Yep. I've often said, and I've been saying quite a bit to my congregation at St. David's, that we're going to come across people, information, things that are going to disturb us and challenge us. And often our immediate response is to be offended or upset or frightened or scared. But I've asked them on lots of occasions to say, well, what happens if we actually try on curiosity? What if we ponder? What if we explore how that might actually exist, or that perspective, or that person has come to that. So that I really like that image, John, of recognizing that the things that challenge us, and the people around us that might actually say things different to what we might be comfortable with, are actually the ones that sharpen us. And it doesn't necessarily mean we surrender our idea or our thoughts in that way, but they actually cause us to become more coherent in those thoughts and ideas. Yeah. But you're right. Also, it could also be easily corrupted as an excuse for saying I can be as abrasive as I want to be because I'm sharpening the people around me. Like, so you could wield the proverb in that way to actually say, well, I'm gonna be a whetstone for the community around us, and that's a way of justifying a way of being as well.
Hopefully other parts of scripture might balance that.
I was thinking about it because one of the things that I have learnt the most from over the past few decades has been listening to trans people, having, started out as a very essentialist feminist, womanhood. And that's been done by shutting up and listening. I don't think, stone has sharpened stone there. It's been a much gentler process, but it's definitely one that I've learned from.
I might be able to cross off one of the other ones from further down the list that does come from Ecclesiastes. John, there's a time for everything. sometimes that can be really, really confronting when you actually go, well, really a time for everything? And then look at the list in that Ecclesiastes passage where it actually says for casting stones and gathering stones, for peace, for war, and so there is that's quite a challenging proverb as well.
Yeah.
I'm just interested to hear from James regarding what is the interpretive. So you said that translation is not necessarily on point.
Oh, I remember seeing a recent article about the fact that the meaning that has become the standard way of rendering it in English, that suggests that the iron, the two iron things are potentially benefiting out of this, was less than clear. As somebody who's more New Testament than Hebrew Bible, I was just throwing that in there. But I was thinking, when Will mentioned the one from Ecclesiastes, right? Known to some people not from Ecclesiastes directly, but from Turn, Turn, Turn by the Birds, or before that. It's all, in some ways it's almost sort of Taoist in that it says there's balance is what's good rather than having just one thing or the other. And of course that's the direction that Star Wars has been leaning when it comes to the Force as of late in particular. But I would argue all along there have been indications of this, right? The whole notion of bringing balance to the Force, where you find this balance point. You realize that things that the Jedi tried to suppress, like love and attachment, can actually make you stronger. But if you go too far in pursuing that, it can also make you selfish. And so, and I find Taoism and Star Wars both helpful in informing and enriching, and being iron that sharpens the iron of my Christian faith might be the way to put it.
We certainly did wander across one of the further ones I was going to look at later on, which is "Without darkness there is no light," which is actually a Star Wars quote. This idea that we actually need both in order to the balance of both in order to exist in the universe. So, what do we think about the idea? Without darkness there is no light.
Light or life?
Light.
Yep. It's interesting. I was actually there's essentially a sort of a bit of poetry in I can't remember which of Octavia Butler's Earthseed novels, but there are these religious verses, right? There's this fictional religion that the main character is developing, and the words are, "Darkness gives shape to the light, just as light shapes the darkness." That between death and life, between light and darkness, and between God and the universe, right? There's this sort of wholeness, so there's this coming together of what might seem like opposites, so that sometimes the coexistence of the two, sometimes the tension and interaction between them, sometimes the balance between them is what actually makes life as we know it possible. So, I think we can make room for that.
And I think we have to, given that colonialism used that dichotomy between light and darkness so badly. And obviously in Australia, where we are still doing colonialism in the 21st century and completely failing to come to terms with the fact that there were people here before most of us arrived. The division between light and dark is something that's been really badly misused.
To misuse something is not to say it's untrue. So binaries can get used in a totally, like, a number of different ways. So who's the light and who's the dark in the colonial narrative?
Depends where you're coming from.
Yeah. So I always get really confused by Hebrews 5:8.
Fill us that one, John.
Jesus learned obedience through the things that he suffered. So there's a number of issues there for me, like the learning of obedience. So some people might want to talk about Jesus as being perfect. So, and perfect tends to mean fully obedient, and we get obedient to the Father, but we also have this thing that says he learnt obedience. So there's a learning of obedience that actually belongs to perfection, if we're going to be theological in that way, and then through the things that he suffered. So that suffering somehow is actually a good, because it leads to learning. So there's a question of what type of suffering. I mean, so one way of thinking about that is to actually talk about pathways in your brain. So part of the thing about learning is that you're forging new pathways in your brain, and that actually is a form of pain, because you're actually having to work your way through things. So students at university go through this all the time, right? They're given all this stuff. They don't know where they stand. It's all very confusing. Like there's real existential crises going on, i.e. suffering, and they're learning, right? They're becoming something else. Pedagogy, paideia, there's something that's going on there. So I don't like the binary of light and dark, but I don't like the binary of light and dark. So like, I think there's ways of actually thinking about this without. So again, to talk about Star Wars, in what world would we think that the Darth laddies are good, the balance of the universe? Right? Because they're trading on that binary, and we're bringing balance to the Force, but there's a way in which, to me, it's unresolved. So the Jedi went too far, suppression of things, but I don't think there's ever been a case that's saying the Darth are actually wholesome individuals that we need to embrace in order to find balance.
Okay. I'll push back on that, because you look at Anakin Skywalker, right? The one who's supposed to bring balance to the Force. And you've got a whole bunch of Jedi and the Sith, sort of maintaining things by keeping the rule of two. And while, all of lots of animated series and various other things have complexified and complicated the scenario that we get at the end of Revenge of the Sith, but it really was, at least in terms of the imagery, two Jedi surviving, right? And two Sith, and there was a certain balance to it. I could also imagine if Anakin, were not just a burning bundle of rage, both in the literal and physical sense of burning, then, I mean, he might have said, when Obi-Wan says, "You're supposed to bring balance to the Force," he's like, "There's two of you and two of us now. What did you think balance would look like?"
Yeah, that's it. So numerical balance,
right? Yeah. But I think as well, what we see there is that, beyond balance as in just two, but constantly in fighting, there's a sense in which, real balance has to integrate, right? And there's so many sci-fi scenarios. Will and I think been talking about some of them. Actually, some of that was also a few days ago in Sci-Fi Church in Sydney. But the Star Trek episode where you have this slime creature where a whole race has sort of tried to make their lives better by taking their shadow selves and everything that's negative about them and putting them all in one place, and then it's stuck there. And it's not poor Tasha. Anyway,
absolutely.
And it's it's taking the thing and pushing it away, right? With suppressing it. We see this so often, right? Of some of the loudest voices saying, look, these horrible things in the world, and then you find out that they're practicing them, right? And that's actually a cover for that. But part of why they're so susceptible is because, they're suppressing, they're demonizing, they're treating as other than, natural biological instincts, these things that are part of them. And when you do that, it turns this thing that you might be able to learn to manage and keep under control into something that rages out of control because you're denying it's part of you. So I think that in this there is something, not for saying, oh yeah, well done, Palpatine, or something like that, but in the sense that the attempt to suppress that side of a balanced life with the Force on the part of the Jedi helps to promote this pursuit of another path that is radically opposite and destructive.
We know the novel Tough Voyaging.
No.
I haven't heard that one.
TUF Voyaging. Who's the guy that wrote not Lord of the Rings?
Do a quick Google search.
George R.R. Martin.
Oh, yes. Yep.
So one of his early books was Tough, TUF Voyaging.
Mm-hmm.
And it was written in 1988, and it was about a guy. So it's out in space, and the guy's basically a salvage person. And he comes across so they've had some sort of apocalypse, and he's come across a colonial, well, whatever the big power was, seed ship that had contained, it was a repository of all the seeds, all the animals, all the embryos from around the world. So it was this huge thing. So people started contacting him, asking for favors to seed their world with different things. And it turned into this massive competition, right? Where one people would try and buy, and it was all about how if you insert something new into it, you're actually breaking a balance.
Mm-hmm.
And because you're breaking that balance, and it just becomes this huge competition between the two. So there are multiple scenarios, but the book at the end resolves into this thing that here we have this huge potential, but we also have this issue about food. We have this issue about, sustenance. We have this issue about love, and how might we use that potential to break the balance in a way that is good for all, rather than in this sort of highly competitive terms.
Yep. Yeah, it's fascinating that we might get hung up sometimes on this idea that the purpose of good is to overcome or to defeat or to destroy evil, when in fact the purpose of good is to be good, to do good, and that just, when we use those metaphors, light and darkness, light doesn't destroy darkness; it just occupies the space, and darkness has to become shadow. It has to recede from that. So there's an interesting dynamic there. I want to just sweep back around, because we just mentioned George R. Martin, and we've been talking a little bit about this idea that I think the words you used, John, was obedience, suffering. You learn obedience from suffering. Davey 89, one of our long-term regular listeners, has come into the chat and said that he thinks it's interesting that redemption arcs from Disney Star Wars. One of the ones that was interesting to him was the Tusken Raiders in the Book of Boba Fett. That there's this idea that a lot of science fiction picks up of the idea of a redemption arc. And as I was thinking about this idea that Jesus learns from suffering, it made me think about the story of the prodigal son, which is one of the proverbial stories we have, where the son actually learns obedience from the suffering of actually going away from the father, and then returns. And so there's, I guess it'd be great for us to have a bit of a chat about the role of redemption arcs, both in our sacred stories, but also in so much of sci-fi. And I think, John, very much in a lot of computer games, often the main character starts out as this sometimes very irredeemable, gruff, outcast individual who actually then is redeemed by whatever actions they take on in a lot of story arcs for computer games.
Unless you choose Evil Dark.
That's true. Yeah, you can go down that path, I guess. Yeah. You have that choice. Yeah.
Yeah. The prodigal son is an interesting one because I really think that label and that way of thinking about the parable is actually misleading, because it's a parable about two lost sons. And the point seems to be the second one, right? That you're halfway through the parable, right? The son that went away has come home, has had a change of heart, arguably, depending on how you understand certain things about it. But there's some reconciliation there. And then you have the older son who feels like he's slaved for the father, who's, and is complaining that he hasn't been rewarded and that he's never disobeyed while he's standing outside and refusing to go in, right? And so he thinks he's obedient, but actually there's this broken relationship there as well. And so often, it's easy to miss the need for redemption among those who think that they're just fine, right? But as far as redemption arcs go, I mean, the one in Star Wars, the original trilogy is just great in as much as it starts with the classic, farm boy meets wizard, rides off to rescue princess and defeat evil. And then the second film takes it to another level and says, excitement, adventure. A Jedi craves not these things, right? That usual gung-ho, I'm gonna slay the evildoers, doesn't actually lead to resolving the problem of evil. And again, that very sort of Taoist balanced moment when Luke has found that his attachment, his love for his sister, can make him angry enough to be strong enough to defeat his father. And then he reaches that moment when he's cut off his arm exactly the way his father had cut off his arm. And he realizes, okay, that's the balance point, right? And it's exactly at that moment that he realized if he goes further, it's not self-defense, it's not protection of loved ones, it's aggression. And he throws down his lightsaber and says, yeah, this far and no further. And the symbolism of it is really, I think, profound and poignant in a way that not everybody appreciates that Star Wars can be. And so we need to proclaim that loud from the mountaintops.
And the actual redemption arc is Anakin Skywalker, Darth Vader. I mean, you think you're watching the story of Luke's hero journey, and then you discover you're actually watching Darth Vader's redemption. And I used that in the first sci-fi service I did, that if Darth Vader could be redeemed, none of us were beyond forgiveness. And which I believed and still believe, but I'm now getting very suspicious about redemption arcs because I suspect that to the victim of violence, the redemption arc of the perpetrator is not going to be a wonderful, moving story. Going right out of sci-fi, Paul Kelly's song, How to Make Gravy.
Yep.
So someone in prison writing to their family at Christmas, talking about how they've stuffed up. And it's this incredibly moving song, How to Make Gravy. But I was talking about it to someone who worked in a legal centre, and she said, yeah, his family's probably really glad he's not with them. He sounds like the archetypal family violence perpetrator. There's a line in the song where he's starting to get a bit jealous about the idea of his brother dancing with his wife. And they're going, yeah, they're probably really glad that he's not around to make the gravy. And I thought, yeah, it really all depends on your perspective. And if you're, one of the people who lost their entire family when Alderaan was exploded, you're probably not going to be deeply moved by Darth Vader's deathbed repentance.
So if we could go back to the balance in the Force, wouldn't we therefore argue that Darth Vader was the ultimate evil? Like he wasn't redeemed because he actually killed the two Sith. So he's actually reinserted a lack of balance into a Force. So he's the one that causes all the other problems that come from then.
Well, unless his son, learned through suffering how to have balance in his own life, right? Which is one possibility, although then he seems to still be struggling with it. And maybe that's, part of it is that, although films and novels and stories always have some happily ever after moment or tragically ever after moment or something, we end them somewhere. But as long as we're alive and in relation with others, there's a struggle to do right, to be fair, to listen rather than just speak, to do all these things.
That's the one thing that Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings films got wrong. That the only thing they got wrong was they ended on the high note of Aragon becoming king, and they didn't go back to the Shire and show the Scouring of the Shire chapters, which is when the hobbits go home and discover that evil has happened in their very home place, the place they thought was safe and innocent and protected. And so the one thing wrong with those films is that it didn't end. It didn't include that bit at the end.
So in the end, they actually defeated evil, but everyone was destroyed and hurt and harmed and traumatized anyway. And so there was kind of that tragic end. It was very poignant in the Lord of the Rings books.
And then, of course, you get Frodo saying, it has been saved, but not for me. And off he goes as the traditional hero who, through his suffering, has redeemed the world for everyone else. Yeah.
The needs of the many outweighed the needs of the few. We've come back to the beginning of our time together.
Have you read Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever?
I read some of them, but a long time ago. I think I found them difficult for the same kind of reason.
Yeah, no, they're hard. It's a hard. So the redemption story is a rape, right? So there's a guy who's a leper, because the father of the author was a doctor in a leper colony, right? So the author himself grew up around lepers. And the point was, this guy had leprosy and no longer had any feeling. And he sort of got transported to this place where he was sort of insta-healed. And all of a sudden he had all his feelings come back to his body, and he sees a woman and basically goes down and rapes her because he sort of thinks that it's an unreal dream type of thing. But he spends all of this time and through these books fighting evil. So fighting evil becomes the main thing. As a leper who can feel the sort of reaction he's having is this real strange conflict between the ability to feel and therefore the move to violence, because that's the thing that he went through. And at the end, right, of the end of the entire thing, the way you defeat the devil is by laughing at him. So it was just this basic, it was a very odd finishing, because it didn't have any of this massive resolution and a massive, cosmic battle between good and evil. It was actually treating evil as just being facile, so Bart would say das Nichtige, right? The nothingness, the thing that doesn't exist, the thing that's just not true, but is true because it's not true. So it's a different way of perhaps dealing with that salvation arc story.
And I guess without these stories, we don't get the opportunity to talk about these things at all. And so one of the things I love about science fiction is and fantasy stories is actually the ability to be able to talk about some of the really hard and difficult issues we've been talking about tonight, but actually to be able to talk about them in a way that's actually in some way separate from us. It allows us to engage with them in a kind of safe external world, an external way, so that we can face sometimes the unfaceable things about ourselves and our society and who we are.
So one of the interesting things there for me is movies about pedophilia by clergy. So there's been a number of them, like El Club. Have you seen El Club, the Club, a Chilean movie, or Doubt?
No.
So how do you actually start to look at the theology that lies behind people doing that as clergy? Like, how do you analyze that theology, because it's immediately in a really bad place? And movies like El Club are really good, and they're hard, they're horrible things to sort of look at. Doubt, such a good movie. You go there and it's at the second distance, and it's actually people discussing what's going on and theologizing about what's going on, especially in El Club, and it actually gives you this buffer, or how would you even describe it? It's not that it's not real, it's that it's really real. And that's actually the thing that allows you to talk about it.
one of the things that I found really helpful in reflecting about clerical sexual abuse is the pirate show Our Flag Means Death, which is, bizarre, queer, fantasy, fun. But there's a character there, a non-binary character called Jim, who her family was killed by assassins when she was a child, and her grandmother, who was a nun, raised her to be a child assassin. And there's just some brilliant imagery about her killing one of these people in a confessional. He goes into a confession to make his confession, and he forgets to confess that, he has done a heap of murders and done everything. And she ends up taking him prisoner and saying, by the way, God's not a fan. And there's just some great redemptive violence imagery in that that I love, and a way that's saying, occasionally when things happen, really bad things happen to children, we should not leap immediately to forgiveness. God is not a fan of really bad things happening to kids. And so there's this great character, Jim, who is an assassin with a knife. And, if you're feeling angry at the church, then, yep, they become they over the course of the program, is right there with you.
Absolutely. I've got another comment coming in from Davey89, and Davey says, I think always saw Darth Sidious as the ultimate evil and Vader as deceived by him. And then Purple Pastor is engaging with that to say, like a circuit breaker. And Davey goes on to talk about doubt and spotlight were both great about this topic in relation to the conversation we were just having. Often what we want to do with darkness when we come across it, and when we come across things that make us feel really uncomfortable or abhorrent to us, is we want to just sort of cover our eyes or close the door on that and say, let's never go there, and let's never talk about this. And in a sense, that actually leaves us in that bottled up place, in that Jedi place we were talking about before, where we actually say, okay, what we need to do is actually just stay away from or forget about. But there's something about our stories, and in particular science fiction type stories, that actually allow us to explore the darkness without being overcome by it or overwhelmed by it. Leads me to the other one I had on the list. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has never overcome it. Or perhaps a less clumsy translation might be understood it. We've been having a fantastic conversation about light and darkness here. How do we feel about science fiction's interaction with that beginning of John?
Yeah, or sometimes suggested rendering it as, and the darkness hasn't grasped it, just because it captures that, both almost the overcoming as well as the understanding, the dual meaning of the Greek there.
Yep.
But yeah, thinking about the start of the Gospel of John, right? And the Gospel of John is often perceived as, there's only one way, and that being the emphasis. And yet in the prologue, it's saying that light that is encountered in the life of Jesus is the same light that gives light to every human being coming into the world. And if we're defining human beings broadly, then presumably that might even mean somebody like Palpatine. And so I wonder, we like to find some character like him that we can say, well, no, he's just so terrible, and to deny the humanity or the personhood or whatever it is. And it seems to me that without excluding the possibility that there could be people who somehow something to do with actually physically, biologically, that's to do with their brain or something like that, that's very rare, right? And most of what we think, most of what gets leads to the stigmatization of people with mental illness, is using that as an explanation for people who just got really angry and haven't learned how to be self-controlled, and who, have easy access to weapons and things like that. And I think we need to recognize that most of what we think of as terrible evil is just people expressing something that any of us, given, whether it's given different attitudes in the present, but probably often, different choices over the course of a very, very long time, that have shaped habits and outlooks and things like that, that it's not as though we couldn't, perhaps through the experience of great trauma, have felt like, the world owes us and we are going to enact our revenge, or we're going to look out for ourselves and not care about others because no one's ever cared for us. And, there's a sense in which just treating, there's a sense in which I'm really glad that Star Wars has moved beyond, the Jedi are great and the Sith are evil, and it's, as a Christian, I believe that the line between good and evil runs through each and every one of us, and I think Star Wars, at its best, does symbolize that pretty well as well.
Okay, Doctor Who.
Okay, let's go. Doctor Who.
Okay, so in terms of the darkness not being able to understand the light, the Master cannot understand the Doctor. And the Master occasionally tries to do things like give the Doctor an army, and the Doctor ends up saying, no, I'm just a madman with a box. Can the Master be redeemed?
Yep. Well, we explore that in some of the Peter Capaldi era stories where the Master becomes Missy, and then the Master and Missy actually are interacting with each other, and there's this amazing scene where the two of them are actually trying to make sense of each other in this amazing time paradox where, am I you, are you me? Am I redeeming or corrupting? Was this great conversation? But it's a great question. Any thoughts from that, James, about the Master and redemption?
I want to say I hope so, right? I mean, I think, that may be the thing where we have to say, it may be that no one other than God could sort this out with infinite time, but yeah, I mean, there have been moments when it seemed like the Master, I mean, the Master's gone over time from a sort of a cardboard cutout, villain to whose actions were largely inexplicable, in some of the very early,
with the twirly mustache and the evil laugh. Yeah.
Right.
Everything the Master has done is explicable if you accept that he or she, depending on the regeneration, has a huge crush on the Doctor and is just desperately trying to get the Doctor's attention.
Yep.
And then everything suddenly makes sense.
And could probably come up with much better ways of doing that if it weren't for that, in his head all the time.
Perhaps we'll see that explored with Chidi Gatwa in the new series. That would be a really interesting thing. If there's any writers of Doctor Who, if Russell T Davis or any of the others are listening out there, then we'd like to see that explored. So, John, you were about to say something?
A conversion story.
Yep.
My own. In 1984, the Killing Fields came out. And I went on, like, I'd never heard of this, right? The thing about always going to the Nazis is that it's just so familiar, but there's tons of other genocides that have gone on all over the world that are, just as bad. If you can compare genocides, which you can't. But the Killing Fields, right? They reckon 6 million dead. It's just atrocious. And I've got I really like metal. So, System of a Down. The lead singer from that went into art and he created a thing, and it was a Pol Pot quote, and it was basically to kill you is no loss, to save you is no gain. Right? So it's the worth. So in other words, you're actually, it doesn't matter if you die. I mean, you like, it's what it is. And I remember distinctly distinctly thinking Pol Pot was pure evil. And if anyone deserved to die, right, if we were going to talk about assassinations or anything like that, it would be Pol Pot. And then my little conversion moment came that said, actually, what separates me and him?
Mm.
Because if I had an army and I had an ideology and I had all these things, what would I do? So when we're talking about something like the other, right? We've talked about binaries an awful lot. So what do we think when we think about the other? And what's his name? Not Leibowitz. Who's the philosopher that did that? It's escaped me again. The other philosophy, not Husserl. What's the name of the guy that the Jewish man who talked about the other an awful lot?
Not Martin Buber.
No, it's not Buber. It's God, it's just gone from me. I will remember it. But he talked about how, you might talk about being anti-Nazism, but position yourself in Berlin in the middle of the Nazi era where everything's blacked out and you have a knock on your door at 10 o'clock at night, and standing in front of that door, Levinas, standing in front of that door is a Jewish person, and they're saying, let me in. And you have a choice to make. Are you going to let them in? Because the likelihood is, if you let them in, they will be discovered and your entire family will be killed.
Mm.
Or don't let them in which case they will die, which they're probably going to do anyway, and your entire family will survive.
Mm.
So if you're abstractly thinking about whether you're anti-Nazi, you have to answer that question.
Mm.
You have to answer the question of that other knocking on your door at 10 o'clock at night where all the people are going to die. So it brings us back to the Spock quote at the beginning, right? Like, it's okay if he dies because he's a Jew and he's going to die anyway. And we're all going to survive. So we can sacrifice him quite easily.
Yep.
And Levinas says, if you reckon that you're going to be anti-Nazi, you need to sit there and ask yourself, what would I do in that situation?
Yep.
Yeah. And I think, another aspect of that is that well, fiction often imagines people that are evil and just seem to have no motives other than they like to rule over others or cause havoc in the universe or whatever. But actually, most people that we would say are doing evil are thinking, well, I'm protecting my family or my people against this perceived threat. And we're as a species, we're not very good at diagnosing evil, and seeing when we're participating in it. And so there's been some good fiction that actually helps us see that. I think sci-fi can sometimes be good precisely because it flies under our radar, right? We're not dealing with Nazis and Jews and ourselves. We're not dealing with Republicans and Democrats. We're not dealing with whichever borders or whichever people groups. We're dealing with aliens that we might not map onto those things until we've already aligned ourselves in the story and then realize, and so
and then suddenly, boom, we're actually then in a position where we're saying, am I the good or the baddie in this situation? Where do I fit? As you were talking, John, I was thinking about having recently watched The Three Body Problem, which is an amazing piece of science fiction as well. I'm looking forward to seeing what future episodes have, and I understand that there's a book that has has triggered it. But in that one, I was absolutely blown away by the acting work of Rosalind Chow, who played Keiko O'Brien in Star Trek, and she finds herself in that Pol Pot kind of situation where there's a genocide going on as a young woman, and she has to watch her own father being killed publicly in front of people. So that's how the series begins. But then actually discovers that she's in a much greater universe, that there are these aliens that are coming, and she's got to try and work out how to engage with that. And she's uncertain when she answers these aliens, because she's a scientist, whether or not the aliens will be good for us or not good for us. And whether or not the not good for us is actually justified because the aliens will perceive us as not good. And so that's like a whole, it really opens this whole question of if I perceive myself as good, then anything I do will actually be good, justified to my own perception. But I may find myself being confronted by others who have decided that I'm the other and that I'm not good. And so, science fiction gives us the opportunity to play around in that scenario altogether.
Yeah,
I think one of the most realistic young adult versions of that was the Hunger Games.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of, what John was talking about what you do with the knock on the door, because it had scenes in which the heroine stood up for what was right. And then we saw that the immediate response was those in power killed the people for whom she was standing up.
Mm.
So, yeah, it's not enough sometimes to stand up and do the right thing if that means that you're actually putting people in danger. So for a young adult series, that was really dark.
Mm. Yep.
I found it.
Did you like the Japanese original?
Which is what?
Battle
what's that?
Royale. Battle Royale. I went and purchased the OG. I saw this when I was really young. I went and purchased the OG movie of it, but it's originally a novel, and it's absolutely fantastic. It's much worse, so much worse than the Hunger Games, like
In that
so
case,
much worse
no,
than that.
I am
But
probably never going to consume it then.
But it's the Japanese version, which is really oof. But it's not sterile, it's forensic. It's really forensic in what it's doing. It's just absolutely fantastic.
Alongside Hunger Games, I remember reading the Divergent series, and another piece of young adult fiction, which is actually also asking the question, if society has decided to other a group of people, does that make it justified? And it raises a whole range of questions that we're really wrestling with as a society today about neurodivergence and what it means to, and what the role and power of the neurotypical are when it comes to exploring how we respond to people who are going to think or operate in a different kind of mode of thinking.
I always thought that I would be inoculated against the Nazis by being queer. I used to have this naivety that queer people would have seen the Nazis for what they were because they were one of the first groups persecuted. And then I discovered all the queer people who were Nazis and who thought that, Hitler didn't really mean what he was saying about them. And it was a real shock to my sense of security that I would have been on the right side. Apparently, even queer people needed to make that decision for themselves. It wasn't automatic.
The Night of the Long Knives should tell you something. All the brown shirts getting massacred.
Yeah. And it's an interesting reminder for queer people that, don't join with the fascists. It will never end well, even if they say they're on your side at the moment.
If you want to borrow my Battle Royale, it cost me a ton. But this is the entire thing. It's even got trump cards, so you can play like a a trump card game from who gets killed. It's well impressive.
And I'm guessing you're meaning
I am
Trump
sticking with.
in the card game sense, not in the
Yeah,
political sense.
it's a trump card game. It's quite cool.
Given you've recommended that, I'm going to recommend that everyone read some nice Terry Pratchett. Gentle, humorous, will raise issues, but without destroying your heart and your guts.
Excellent. Good segue there. Avril, can you give us some have you got a pithy quote from Terry Pratchett, maybe a Hogfather quote or something like that you can get us to look at our next bit with?
I can't give you a quote. I can give you that the overarching theme in all of his books are the importance of not seeing the importance of seeing human beings as subjects, not objects. And the importance of never using other human beings as a means to an end. So
your summary there gave me a chance just to quickly look one up and remember one from the Hogfather that says, "Take the universe and grind it down to its finest powder, sieve it through the finest sieve, and then show me one atom of justice, one molecule of mercy, and yet you act as if there is some ideal order in the world, as if there is some rightness in the universe by which it may be judged." And this is a quote from Death itself, who has actually decided to this particular one's been given the task of making Christmas happen, I think, in the Hogfather. And so this idea that we think we might be able to refine ourselves into justice, when in fact, I think sometimes what this is suggesting is perhaps we need to be expanding ourselves in order to be able to find out what justice means.
Terry Pratchett's delightful and funny because on the one hand, he's deeply committed as an atheist or agnostic to the idea that there is no higher power, there is no greater meaning. And on the other hand, it is so obvious that he deeply believes there is justice. Justice has content. There is a meaning to life. And one of his best characters, Sergeant Vimes, who keeps getting promoted until by the end I think he's the Duke of Ankh-Morpork, obviously has a deep commitment to justice and a belief that it exists. So whatever death may say, at the very least humans believe in justice, and it's a good thing.
Well, there's no way we'll solve all of the problems and quandaries and questions in one sitting tonight, even with the help of some excellent science fiction, and we've listed some amazing science fiction this evening. I think I've had a lot of fun doing this evening, and I hope you have too. And I'd love to do this again at some point. If there are those who are listening to this either as a podcast or catching it as a broadcast on Twitch or seeing it on YouTube, if you'd like to leave us comments or get in touch with us at Never Odd or Even, then and let us know in particular what topics you'd like to cover or work through, then we'd love to hear from you. And they're just, the universe is so vast. I mean, our universe is so vast, and science fiction actually allows us to multiply those universes by infinity. As some final thoughts before we come to a close, any final thoughts people would like to throw in?
So I'd like to ask a question about healing.
Yep.
So we've got salvation arcs, but healing.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a different question, but I really love the Gormenghast trilogy by Mervyn Peake. So part of that is actually about healing, and it's about loneliness, and it's about enclosure, and it's about isolation. And Mervyn Peake was an artist, and he hand drew a lot of images at the end of World War II. So evidently he went into one of, I forget which concentration camp it was, but he went into a concentration camp and had to draw the images of what was going on. And this really disturbed him. Like it broke him, like mental health, complete break. And the only way that he could find healing was actually about writing the Gormenghast trilogies. So as a author, he's looking for healing. So that, I mean, they compare him with Tolkien now, but he wasn't sort of discovered until well after. But so he himself has found healing through this, but also the narrative is really dark. It's uber dark, but it's also about trying to find healing for this castle that's just completely broken. So salvation arcs, yes, but where are the sort of the fundamental healing arcs, the ones that are actually not about reconciliation, not about this light versus dark narrative, but just something that's really human about, how do we work our way through this world in a way that, we are broken and we're all looking for healing as we're moving our way through it.
Absolutely. We had just a couple more comments from the the chat feed. Dav Sav for Life has commented and said that that there is a oh, hang on, I've just lost my place there. That this has been a really good opportunity to hear different ways of exploring theology and even difficult subject issues. And so that's been really helpful from their perspective. So thanks, Davsef, for passing that on. And certainly, John, your narrative there about healing sets a really, really good challenge for the next one, to actually go, well, let's have a dig into some of those narratives that are actually looking at and reframe some of the narratives that might even be immediately perceived by us as being redemption arcs or salvation arcs or balancing or justice, but actually ask the healing question. What does it mean to have and many of our stories do have this kind of healing aspect to them, but they'll often be overwhelmed by these other arcs that might be imposed on them because they're safer and they're easier for us to actually work with. Any other final thoughts before we wrap up for the evening?
Are you allowed?
I think Dr. Who
final
has a
thoughts
few.
in sci-fi?
Their final thoughts in sci-fi. Go on, Avril.
When John mentioned healing arcs, it's weird, but the one that immediately came to my mind was The Dark Crystal by Jim Henson.
Oh, brilliant.
Yeah. And also I think the first seasons of new Doctor Who were all about healing the Doctor's trauma through that. So
yeah,
those are my thoughts.
So certainly in that with Doctor and Donna kind of going on that little trip with you mean with David Tennant in those episodes where he was coming to terms with where he had been, and I love that there were some references in that to actually to stopping and waiting and not continually running, which was actually really fascinating. Yeah. James, anything final from you?
I appreciated that somebody commented that this bringing together of sci-fi and theology gives us a chance to highlight that both of them are about exploring, imagining, but doing so in a way that leads us back to reflection about the real world, ourselves. Storytelling and imagination are one of the only ways that we actually get at aspects of ourselves that otherwise we wouldn't notice. So yeah, quote from the Doctor, none of us know for sure what's out there. That's why we keep looking. Keep your faith, travel. Hopefully the universe will surprise you constantly.
Absolutely. And I think just from me, one final on this idea of the healing arc, and I'd love to continue on with this next time, but the movie What Dreams May Come with Robin Williams is actually a fascinating arc of healing even beyond death. So working through what it means for us to be whole, but not in a way that actually is ableist or actually wanting to define or remove from us the things, perhaps even the scars that have actually made us who we are, but actually instead embracing those things so that we can feel a wholeness because of our journey. So wherever you are, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And it may not be this evening for you because we've got this option to hear and see and be in any time and space now that we're operating in this digital realm. We're really glad that you have joined us in any way that you can. My big thanks once again to Professor James McGrath, to Professor John Flett and Reverend Dr. Averil Hannah-Jones, all bringing great value to this conversation. And it's wonderful that we could be together. And I look forward to the next time we can have a conversation like this.